Hi again, Cor Unum Philosophy cohort. We're still looking at justification of our beliefs, or justification of our judgments. So we hold something to be true, we hold a belief to be true. What justifies that? Well, we're going to look at two levels of justification. There's two levels of justification often suggested. The first we might call foundational. We might call it direct or basic, right? A foundational source of justification. This is a source of belief justification which is not reliant on any other source of justification. So it doesn't go back in a chain of justifications. It's foundational in that sense. It doesn't rely on others. Well, what might be an example of this? Well, for example, seeing the maple tree in blossom outside of my window directly justifies my belief the maple tree outside is in bloom without relying on any other source of justification for that belief. It's another example. Hearing footsteps on the porch directly, that is, all by itself, justifies my belief that someone is on the porch without relying on other sources of justification. So you could probably apply this to all of our sense data. Usually, I see something, I hear something, I feel something. I'm directly justified in believing something based on that. Similarly, simply understanding the meaning of the sentence, all bachelors are unmarried, directly justifies it as a belief or judgment, right? I simply understand what bachelors means and unmarried means, and simply by understanding the words in that sentence, it directly justifies me in that belief that all bachelors are unmarried. I don't have to go poll every bachelor. Experiencing a headache directly justifies my belief that I in fact have a headache. I don't have to have other things justify that, this simple experience of it. So foundational, direct, basic sources of justification. Now that goes for a lot of our common experience, but it turns out that a tremendous amount of our beliefs doesn't come from foundational sources of justification, things like sensing them or just simply understanding the meaning of words, directly perceiving them. This is where the second level of justification comes in, one that's critically important to all kinds of our knowledge. That's derivative, right? So if it's not foundational, it's derivative. If it's not direct, it's indirect. If it's not basic, well, then it's non-basic, huh? This derivative justification, indirect, non-basic, this is any source of belief justification which requires derivation from other justified beliefs, or which relies, at least in part, on some other mode of justification. See, so it's the stringing together of justification, often back to foundational justifications. So we can talk about two examples of this derivative or indirect justification. The first, and again, tremendously important one for us, is testimony. Think about the vast amount of beliefs you hold to be true that you take on the testimony of others. Books you've read, documentaries you've watched, family photos of trips that you weren't on. I mean, just vast amounts of what we believe we justify by testimony. But notice, I don't believe that Alaska exists in a foundational way because I've been there. Now maybe you have, and then you have a foundational belief. You stood in Anchorage and you saw it. I haven't. So my belief that, my true belief that Alaska exists is based on testimony. It's indirect, right? It's derivative. And actually, of course, so we couldn't do philosophy without even more subcategories. There's two kinds, we could say, of testimony. And the exact distinction for us won't be terribly important, but we could talk about a formal sense, right? This would be found, for instance, in court proceedings. Right? This might be understood as a form of inference, right? Something like we would there's this formal thought process that might go on. Something like, Frank said that Gloria shot Bob. Frank is trustworthy, that is, he's sincere, honest, and he's competent to make that judgment. Therefore, I ought to believe that Gloria did indeed shoot Bob, right? So there's this kind of formal inference process that goes along with testimony. That would be an example, right? An example would be a court proceeding where a testimony of a witness, I should believe them because, and I come out to a conclusion. Well, it turns out most of our, the way we believe testimony doesn't necessarily follow that logical pattern of thought, right? It's more intuitive, if you will, right? So we could call that the informal sense of testimony, right? By testimony in the informal sense, this is just simply anyone telling anyone anything else, right? And we get this all the time. It's actually a surprisingly complex mode of justifying beliefs in the recipient of the testimony, and is, as a result, sometimes kind of hard to categorize. Think about it. What justifies me in believing my wife when she tells me about her day? And is that different than when a stranger comes up on the street and starts telling me about his day? Right? They're both forms of informal testimony, but what justifies me in believing in each case might be quite different. So what can we say about this informal testimony, again, which we rely on in large amounts of our beliefs? Well, on the one hand, informal testimony can generate justified beliefs in the recipient without being the end product of conscious and explicit reasoning like we found in the formal testimony, right? I don't have to sit there and go, okay, my wife told me that she went to Aldi today. My wife generally tells me the truth. My wife goes to Aldi often. She has a receipt from Aldi, right? I don't need to go through that formal reasoning process for this informal testimony. Another example. Just listening to anyone offering a report on something we don't know about, we come to an estimation of their credibility without much explicit analysis or reasoning. We tend to do this kind of intuitively. If we find the attester is credible, we're justified in believing his or her report. Thus, the kind of justification of belief engendered in the recipient of a testimony is, in one sense, immediate, right? We don't go through this kind of long process. It happens immediately or almost intuitively. Nevertheless, we may still classify informal testimony as non-basic or derivative. So even though it seems intuitive, foundational, right, we can still call it derivative or indirect because it does rely on other direct sources of justification. Most importantly, perception. Perception of the attester and his words. And in particular, our perception of the many subtle observables which count in favor or against the attester's credibility, even if those perceptions are not explicitly formulated in beliefs and premises. So, we have all these perceptions about people as they come and tell us things that even though we don't formally put them into arguments, are part of what goes together to help us with the judgment that that person is credible and can be trusted. What contributes, or we could ask the question, what contributes here to the credibility of a witness? Things like sincerity, that is honesty, or competence relative to the matter reported. So it's not simply, right, I think the point here, why this is derivative, this informal testimony, right? It's not someone tells us something and we just automatically believe it. There's this whole web of perceptions of their credibility and reliability and competence that go together to justify our belief in their testimony. And again, you could think about all of the different things you claim to know. Probably most of them, probably a very high level of the most of them, comes from this informal testimony. Okay. So again, we're talking about examples of derivative or indirect justification. One would be testimony. Another would be what we call inference, right? A second example of indirect or non-basic justification is inference. We could call this reasoning. I may infer the justified belief that Gloria can drive to Kenosha based on my perception-based beliefs, which are therefore directly justified beliefs. Okay, so what's going on here? I know it's a complicated thought there. So I have the justified belief, or let's say I have the belief that Gloria can drive to Kenosha, even if I don't see her doing it. This is the point, right? If I'm in the car with Gloria and she's driving to Kenosha, that would be a directly justified belief. I'm seeing it with my own eyes, right? But there are other things that are perception-based beliefs, other things that are directly justified, that would justify me in believing Gloria can drive to Kenosha, even if I don't see her doing it. So for instance, I have perception-based beliefs that Gloria has a car. I've seen her car. That she can drive. I've seen her drive, right? Those are directly justified beliefs by my seeing her do it. Because my belief that Gloria can drive to Kenosha is dependent on other beliefs, it's said to be indirectly justified. But notice also that in that example, to make the inference work, I also need the belief that all who have cars and can drive are able to drive to Kenosha, right? I mean, maybe Kenosha is an island you can't drive to, right? I have to have other beliefs involved there. And the justification for that general belief is likewise indirect, because it's based on an inference from other beliefs. A host of individual beliefs based on my perceptions of the capabilities of individuals driving cars. Okay, thus, all forms of reasoning, right, drawing conclusions based on premises, are forms of indirect, non-foundational justification. And we do this all of the time. So this is simply to notice at this point the different kinds of justification, right? That I'm justified for beliefs perhaps because I directly perceive them or experience them, right? This direct justification. But then there's these indirect justifications we use constantly for things we don't experience firsthand. Testimony, and then inference. We build on our beliefs. Here's another example. I forgot I had this on here until just now. Here's an inference puzzle, right? What did mom order for dinner, right? I would be directly justified, if I were standing here, I'd be directly justified in believing that somebody delivered a box labeled pizza to mom. And I would be directly justified in believing that the person delivering it is wearing a hat from Paul's Pizza, right? Etc. You could go on that. Just because I see it, direct justification. Maybe I smell, right? You see there's the little waves coming off of it. Maybe I smell it. So I'm directly justified in believing that whatever's in the box smells like pizza, right? Inference, right? Inference would be the indirect justification that from all of those things I reason to the belief that mom ordered pizza for dinner, right? Or maybe mom told me before she went to the door that the pizza was on the way, and I believe I have that belief justified because of her testimony. So you see, there's this whole web of justifications for our beliefs. Now, when we come back, now we get to ask some of the interesting philosophical questions about our justifications for our beliefs. So stay tuned.